Good evening. We'll go ahead and begin our class out here. We're going to be in John chapter 10. John chapter 10. Thankful again to be here with you all and looking forward to just continuing in the studies of the I am statements of Jesus. We're going to cover two this evening in John chapter 10 with the door and the shepherd. We're just going to go really verse by verse through this, but I shouldn't have said open your Bibles to John 9 because we're going to go to Ezekiel 34. So I was wrong about that. Go to Ezekiel 34 with me. I want to look at a couple places in the Old Testament and just display this point of shepherds being talked about and the shepherds that came before Jesus, and this precedent in which Jesus is the good shepherd in comparison to the shepherds that came before. So Ezekiel chapter 34, and if I could get a volunteer to read the first 6 verses of that chapter. Ben, thank you.
34, 1 through 6.
Yes.
Then this message came to me from the Lord. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds, the leaders of Israel. Give them this message from the sovereign Lord. What sorrow awaits you shepherds who feed yourselves instead of your flocks? Shouldn't shepherds feed their sheep? You drink the milk, wear the wool, and butcher the best animals, but you let your flocks starve. You have not taken care of the weak. You have not tended the sick or bound up the injured. You have not gone looking for those who have wandered away and are lost. Instead, you have ruled them with harshness and cruelty. So my sheep have been scattered without a shepherd, and they are easy prey for any wild animal. They have wandered through all the mountains and all the hills across the face of the earth, yet no one has gone to search for them.
Awesome. Thank you. So what kind of qualities do we see of these shepherds listed in this chapter, those verses? Selfish. Selfish jumps off the page rather immediately. They're certainly looking after themselves. Anything else? Neglectful. Very good. So by being so looking so inwardly, they're not taking care of their other responsibilities that they have. You'll see in the rest of this chapter, you see that they're going to have punishment. But from verse 11 to the end of the chapter, there's this hope that you're going to see of God saving, of this servant that is going to come. There's this hope that is promised to the people. Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 1 through 4 is very similar. You have to turn there to read those, but it is very similar to Ezekiel 34, 1 through 6, of the quality of character of the shepherds in that time. And it's interesting as well, the following verses, verse 5 through 6, are prophetically talking about Jesus. So certainly a time of hope coming after that point with the shepherds. I want to start there because this really brings us into John 10 and seeing the contrast of the shepherds that have come before and in years before, as well as the shepherds in more of an immediate sense that have come before Jesus, like the Pharisees and those and like the scribes as well, and seeing the comparison between them and Jesus. You find in John chapter 10, or I should say in chapter 9, what brings us into these statements is the story of the blind man. After Jesus heals the blind man, cures the blind man, what happens after that? Right, there's a debate whether he's actually blind. There's even a debate whether who Jesus is. I don't know if he's the prophet, if he's just some false teacher, I guess to say. And so that we certainly see that conversation go on. We see they even go to his parents and talk to them. They go to him directly after his parents say, go talk to him. He's old enough to handle himself. And they have this discussion. Eventually, when we get back to verse 35 of chapter 9, we see that Jesus finds this man. As this man did not know it was Jesus that healed him. He knew that someone healed him, did not realize who Jesus was that healed him, of course. And Jesus will show that he is the Son of Man to this now the formerly healed blind man. And really getting to verse 40. I think verse 40 is what brings about the context of what Jesus is about to say, where the Pharisees hear what Jesus said in 39 about how he came to bring judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And they respond to that, but we are not blind too, are we? And Jesus responds in verse 41, if you were blind, you would have no sin. Now that but now that you maintain, we see your sin remains. And this is where I think we get Jesus getting into this parable. And you have those that were the shepherds in this time and seeing the contrast between them and Jesus. Anything before we get into chapter 10? Anyone like to mention? All right. So we'll go ahead and get into the first 6 verses then. Just getting into the parable portion, if you will. You can kind of view verses 1 through 6 as the story, if you will, and the rest of it as the explanation. Certainly we see that in other places in the scripture. Namely, you think about the parable of the sower, how Jesus tells it, and then we'll tell the meaning. And you can't miss what the meaning's about. I think this is rather similar to that. You have in verse 1, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the one who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber." We certainly understand that making a lot of sense. We know that even in our time today, robbers don't often go through the traditional entrance, right? Because that's the entrance that's expected. That's the entrance that's going to be more fortified, whether it's locks or probably the alarm system is going to be closer to the door. But if you have something else, another entry point that maybe is not as expected, that's where you're going to, you typically, I'm not a robber myself, but that's where you typically would go, I would imagine, right? And so we certainly can see verse 1 in the reality of that. But what's the contrast to that in verse 2? Right. So you have the one that has the authority, the one that is the true shepherd actually goes in through the normal way. The way that is actually the acceptable way because of his position. He's going to enter the door, and in verse 3 you have the doorkeeper, the presence of the doorkeeper. So this is just an illustration-like picture of the sheep being inside there, and you have the doorkeeper being at the door. Obviously it's not a real picture, but just to give this idea of what it may look like. You have that the doorkeeper would be there, and the walk up to this doorkeeper, and he recognizes this is not a stranger, this is not a robber, this is not a thief. I know this person. I know he's the shepherd, and so I let him in. We see the doorkeeper do that, and when he comes in, we see that the sheep listen to his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name. Calls them by name. We'll circle back to that later on, and he's going to lead them out. Leads them out in verse 3. Verse 4, you have another mention of leading, again, by him going ahead of them in verse 4. He goes out ahead. He's still, the sheep are still following him because they know his voice. And what's that contrasted to in verse 5? Here we go. Yes, so the stranger in comparison to the shepherd. And this is really the parable, the story portion of it, if you will, and Jesus will get into the meaning here in verse 7 through verse 18. Verse 6 makes it very clear that he was speaking in a figurative-like manner, and so they did not understand what these things meant when he was saying to them, and so Jesus will begin to teach. You have in verse 7 through 10, you're going to have the portion of the door. So that's what we're going to focus on, just going in the order in which Jesus goes into. What does he say with him being the door? What does that mean? What does it mean that Jesus is the door? What does he say? Wayne?
He's the way you enter.
Yeah, exactly. He's the way that you enter. He's the way into safety. I think you read verse 7 and 9 in tandem, you very clearly will see that. Verse 7, him saying, "I am the door of the sheep." Verse 9, he mentions, "If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and find pasture." So you're going to find safety and going to find pasture by entering the door there. You have verse 8, you have what we have as the thieves and the robbers that were mentioned. These are the ones that the sheep do not listen to. They don't know their voice. They're not going to come in through the natural way, so not going to listen to them. When you keep what we read from the prophets in mind, of Ezekiel 34, and then when we refer to Jeremiah 23, we can kind of see these characteristics of the thieves fitting into those that we read from those chapters from the prophets. If you have those that were selfish, thieves and robbers are selfish. He's looking after selfish gain. What can I get out of this? What can I get from the sheep? That's why they're trying to get in some capacity, to benefit from the sheep. Jesus, the door, is not like that. There's not necessarily a benefit of the soul selfishness there. There's protection. There's pasture. There's safety that is provided for. And safety is something we see numerous times presented throughout the scriptures. You think about some of the Psalms as an example. Psalm 91, we'll call God a refuge. We'll call him a fortress. We'll call him a dwelling place. Are there any other kind of terminology you think of in the Psalms that refer to God in kind of this protection-like manner?
Shield surrounding us.
Yeah, very good. So you have a shield surrounding us. Even Psalm 91 describes God's faithfulness as a shield and a wall. Very good. Any other ones? Yeah, so there's certainly many that we can see. Psalm 46, verse 1, I think is powerful because it mentions God is our refuge and strength, a very ready help in trouble. And that's absolutely very powerful. We just can see that from that verse. Verse 2 and 3 after that, it mentions these things that would certainly bring about fear. Things like earthquakes, things like mountains falling into the sea, the waters roaring and quaking. These powerful things, but these things that we do not need to be fearful of, because you go back to verse 1. You don't need to be fearful of those things because God is our refuge. And so you have this point of protection that we see with the door and the comfort that we can have in that. What do we know about Jesus in regard to going after the enemies? What are some verses or maybe thoughts that come with that? How does Jesus protect us? Or how is he our refuge? Yeah.
Think about Revelation and the battle Armageddon. So you also think about when you see the Lord part of Christ, which was part of Revelation.
Yeah, so there's this ultimate point of Jesus achieving victory that we can certainly see. Very good. How else? Yes.
He gives us guidelines and boundaries, not to be mean, but to help us, to help guide us.
Yeah.
Through his word.
Right. You can certainly see from an animal perspective, when you look at the sheep, they certainly need a lot of guidance. A lot of ways to keep them, certainly with the door, to keep them inside the pasture. Jesus provides us that protection, that structure. Very good. Anything else?
I don't know if that's exactly what you're going after, but I think too in this idea of just as Christians we understand that God is in control of everything, right? We can go through the minor prophets, right? And there's not a nation that is or has been that God didn't first ordain, set up, and control his total path, right? And he's controlled everything up to this point. He controls everything until the time he returns, and obviously he's still in control at that point. And that just that idea that though the valleys, right, the darkness, all those things, those trials that may come, he's never leaving us, right? The idea of constantly being our refuge because this is the end of the dying. He's promised us that eternal.
Right. Yeah, just that, you look at John 10 as a whole, you have that protection, but also that guidance that we'll get to. Thank you. Yeah.
When you talk about the enemies, it made me think of Psalm 23, that the Lord prepares the table in the presence of our enemies. And one of the ways I've heard that presented is that we don't have anything to fear from our enemies because God's provision is perfectly supplying what we need, and we have nothing to fear.
Right. And we certainly see that in, I think, verses to go along with that point. If you have 1 John 3, verse 8, talks about the Son of God appeared for the purpose to destroy the works of the devil. Or Hebrews 2:14 talks about Jesus taking on flesh that he might destroy death and the one who has power over death. You have this point of victory and giving protection. That certainly goes along with that point. Anything else that you see that comes out with the door? Wayne?
In John, he talks about the fact that a hired hand will flee, but he stays with us no matter what and protects us.
Right. There's no running away, and there's no selfishness in any of that. Whether it's the thieves, he's not like a thief. He's not like a hired hand in verse 12 and 13. He's going to stay around. You have in verse 10 that he brings about abundant life. As is mentioned, the thief only comes to steal, kill, and destroy. All selfish actions, all actions that only benefit the thief. But you have that Jesus did not come to do those things, but came to give life. To give life and to give it abundantly. And what did that take? His death. It took him to lay down his life there. It took him to lay down his life, as we'll see. He, in verse 11, as it says, I am the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. You have verse 17 and 18 make it abundantly clear that this was within his authority. It was in his authority to lay down his life. It was in his authority to take it back up, as is mentioned in those verses, namely at the end of verse 18 there. I think what's interesting, make a comparison between David and Jesus. What do we know about David in his time as a shepherd? Yeah. Yeah.
Animals with rocks and this slate.
Yeah, very good.
I might be mixing up my Bible studies.
Yeah, you have that. He does fight the bears and the lions that we see. That they come and they get one of the sheep, and he immediately is going to go after them. We know it was his father's sheep. He's tending after them, but he goes nonetheless to go and to save this sheep. And you think about it, with a bear and a lion, I mean, that's two of the most ferocious animals you can find on planet Earth. But yet David being willing to go after, and it mentions in 1 Samuel 17, verse 34 through 36, that he rescues them from the mouth of that animal. So amazing to go and put yourself not only in danger to do that, to rescue the sheep, and that sheep is now free, but what else does David have to do beyond the rescuing? Kill. So then you see the animal go from, well, if I can't get the sheep, I'm going to get the guy who's taking the sheep out of my mouth, and is going to go ahead and go after David, and David kills those animals. And what did David equate that to in relation to what's coming up for him? Say again? Goliath, yes. So you have that point there in verse 37 of that chapter that he brings out that just as God was with me with the lion and the bear, Goliath's going to be no different. I think bringing up David just because when you have the sheep that David deals with, that David helps with, there's no sense of thought between the animal, the sheep. There's just innocence. There's no planning that comes along. The bear and the lion just comes and seeks and takes them, and there's no thought of what's going on. I think, for interesting for us, is we had some level of knowledge and knowing where we were going. We decided if we equate the bear and the lion to sin, we knew. We put ourselves in its mouth. There wasn't something that took us by surprise. In some capacity, we went willingly. You imagine, you don't see a sheep, the animal, going willingly with a bear or a lion. That doesn't happen. But we went after the sin. We went and put ourselves in that harm's way, and our shepherd still got us out. So there's a difference between David went and got these animals that were innocent, had no thought whatsoever. We chose willingly. The Bible describes us as enemies. We were dead in our sin. All of these things that the New Testament describes. And while we were still enemies, God came and saved us from the fate that we put ourselves in. There's a powerful point with that. I think, too, you have that David walked away. David's going to walk out from this battle. He walks out from the lion and the bear, interacting with these things, walks away with the sheep. Jesus had to die. He died to save his sheep. He rises from the dead 3 days later, of course, but he died and all that he went through in order to save his sheep. Is there anything else that comes to mind when you compare those two in their times as shepherds? Tyler?
Just going to say, thinking about David, he was put in that position because he was the youngest. It's a very humble position. You weren't becoming a shepherd to get glory or get a lot of people to say, wow, that's really impressive. You must have a really strong skill set to be a shepherd. But they're doing it because it's needed, and they're taking care of something that can't take care of itself. And so Jesus shows his humility in this aspect of calling himself a good shepherd as well, that he's not bemoaning the task. He's not doing it for, as we saw with Ezekiel 34, ulterior motives. He genuinely cares about us.
I think you see it kind of with that point of verse 12 and 13 with the hired hand, where Jesus isn't like the point of, well, these sheep aren't that important to me to get into this situation. The hired hand is there because for the money, as we see. He's just there because he's hired. He doesn't care about the sheep. Jesus wasn't like that. And I think it's interesting when you think about sheep and a shepherd, one's obviously a lot more important than the other. The shepherd's obviously, both in an earthly sense, obviously in a spiritual sense. The shepherd's more important than the sheep. But the humility, the love, the unselfishness to put oneself in that position to save the sheep is rather remarkable. Brian?
So this is not a comparison of David and Jesus.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But another time, you were talking about the sheep and laying down their lives. So like David sins at the end of his life, right? And God starts punishing the entire nation. But David's response to him is that don't punish the sheep. I was the one who did the sin, right? And then he falls into the hands of God. Again, that caring piece, I know Jesus is perfect, right? I'm not trying to make that comparison. That idea of one, falling into the hands of the Lord, knowing that that's his only hope and deliverance, but two, that just that genuine care for the flock, and that idea that just with my sin, they shouldn't be punished for it, right? That they should come to me.
Yeah, taking it upon himself is amazing. Excellent. Anything else comes to mind?
One
Yeah.
thought I had about when Tyler talked about a humble position of a shepherd, I thought about Moses and his training ground before he went back into Egypt to help lead the people out. That he was in shepherd training literally for 40 years before he did that. So that was really just a great training for God to train him on what he's about to do physically.
Yeah, it's pretty neat to see how often shepherds are mentioned in the Bible. I mean, from Jesus' birth, they're mentioned in Luke 2, a lot in Genesis of different people. The prophet Amos is another example. But it is. That's awesome. Was there another hand? Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, on this level of humility, the pay, I can't imagine would have been good to be a shepherd, right? I mean, just like we take that kind of as an assumption of today, hey, what am I getting paid for this job? Very transactional. And the examples that were brought up, you weren't doing this because of the glory. You were doing it because your heart cared about what you were doing and what it was doing for something that wasn't you, right? And so obviously not an accident that this is sprinkled all the way through the Bible as an example, but that's just one for me. It's reflecting in our American, what have you done for me lately with this job, right? Taking care of others isn't something you really, if the pay is not that, you're not doing this out of selfish reasons to be a shepherd, right? So Jesus and others, right? And similar to today, right? If you're trying to take care of others, it needs to be a selfish thing.
Yeah, this is what I think the perception of the shepherd made me think about Eliab when David comes down and he's, what'd you leave those few sheep there for? And that point he kind of makes in 1 Samuel 17:28. But it is that unselfish nature that we need to see. Very good. Anything else? All right, very good. So we'll continue to move along then. I think it's interesting to point out in Isaiah 53, verse 7, just to this point of the sheep, a passage I'm sure we know, maybe even just by saying it, what that verse may say, but a passage we're familiar with, where it mentions that like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that is silent before its shearers. I think it's interesting to think about that Jesus became a sheep. Jesus became a lamb. You have him becoming these things in order for us to have this life. I think it's just very powerful. Obviously, we know him becoming man. That's powerful. We talk about that often. But just in relation to the sheep and the shepherd conversation, him becoming as a shepherd or as a sheep or as a lamb and putting himself in these positions, allowing man to do these things, allowing himself to be numbered with the wrongdoers and all the things that Isaiah 53 mentions is rather remarkable. When we continued into verse 13, we find as well verse 14, that he says, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. You have this knowledge that we see in verse 15 and 14. The knowledge of knowing the shepherd, and the shepherd knowing his sheep there. I want to go over to the Psalms and go over Psalm 139 and spend some time there. Mentioned going to circle back to the calling of the names that was mentioned in John chapter 10, verse 3 through 4, and how he knows their names, he leads them out, he calls them. I want to go to Psalm 139 mainly to talk about that. Is you have this powerful psalm that is something that we're all able to look at, we're all able to put our name in, where it says places like me or I, and realize that it's the same for us. That we're able to say things like verse 1 is just an example. Lord, you have searched me and known me. Knows you by name, knows who you are, searched. When we think of the word search, is that something that requires little effort? No, right? Search doesn't require little effort. When you search, just like in Luke 15, for example, when they were searching for the lost coin, you have that point of the woman searching there. It wasn't a search of just, if I get it, I get it. It was being willing to move everything, move all these things out of the way because it was that important. That's what searching is. Searching is recognizing the value, and I'm going to get it. So God has placed that value on us. You have that he knows our ways in verse 3, and the latter part of that verse, acquainted with all my ways. That's a rather comforting or rather scary verse, depending on our ways. But he knows who we are. He knows our ways. He knows our paths. He knows our words before we even know our words in verse 4. He knows what we're going to say. And then in verse 5 through 12, you see this overwhelming point of there's nowhere you can go that he's going to be separate. He knows where we are. He knows from the highest points to the lowest points. He knows and cares about his people. And we arrived to verse 13 through 16, probably the most well-known verses from this psalm. And someone go ahead and read those real quick for me. Matt? Oh, sorry. Good. Thank you.
You formed my inward parts. You molded me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well.
Yes, please. Sorry.
My frame was not hidden from you when I was made a secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them.
Awesome. Thank you. When you read those verses, what stands out to you or what provides comfort to you when you read those verses?
I just think it's just pure love. I mean, you can think of a parent loving their child, but this is even before that, how much God knows everything about us, and that's just pure love to even care enough to create us.
Yeah. Right. It's absolute by choice. I think just as verse 1 talked about, it's a choice to search and know that God has made to create. Is that same choice? Anything else? Oh, yes.
I just like where it says, you know me inside and out. So that's kind of I don't know, should bring comfort in the fact that, okay, God does want to hear me and he wants to know what I've done or whatever. But at the end of the day, he already knows. So that should make it a little easier for, I don't know, confession or just talking to him in general. He
Yeah.
already knows.
Right. There's nothing we can hide. He knows, and there is that comfort in that. That's awesome. Yeah.
I think the other thing, you brought this up earlier, is that you see the value of us, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. It's easy to put ourselves down sometimes. And just sort of reminder of how the Creator views us is so important.
Yeah, the value is very clearly seen. I think verse 17 and 18, for me, really bring that to a head in these verses. We'll get to that in a second. Ben?
So this is half of the picture that Jesus is talking about back in John 10. He knows us better than we could hope to know ourselves ever. But when he talks about them knowing his voice or not following the others because it wasn't a recognized voice, I've got a lot more experience with goats than sheep. But the one time one of the times I went and took care of my uncle's sheep while he was gone, he told me the right things to do and all the right things to say. And the sheep would come near because I said the right thing, but they knew it wasn't me. It wasn't him. It wasn't someone that they recognized. And I think that's a really important point for us to take from this. Someone can be saying the right things, but if it's not coming from Jesus, maybe they're using a lot of the right words, but the message isn't going to be the same, potentially. So we need to be familiar enough with Jesus' words, just like he's familiar with us from this passage in Psalm, that if somebody says something and it's got that off feeling, that we follow that and run back to Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. They've done experiments like that. Yours was literal, but they've done experiments like that where to dress up to take away the appearance point and call out, and they don't follow or change, like you said. Very good. Very good. And we'll get to John 10, verses 26 through 28, I think really get to that point as well. We'll get to that in just a second. Verse 17 and 18, though, I think are always very powerful. Of how precious also are your thoughts for me, God. How vast is the sum of them. Why to count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I am awake, I am still with you. Just love this picture that you have of going around, you count every single piece of sand. Around all the oceans, around all the beaches, wherever you can find sand. Count it all up, not make one mistake in counting one twice or skipping one or whatever it may be. And that number, whatever it is, doesn't compare to how much God thinks about you. Is amazing. Is amazing. I think I might have said this when I was at West Mason. I know I have Northern Kentucky, where if God said that He would think about me one time, sign me up, right? That's good. I mean, this many times and then some, and without a number, that's amazing. That's value. You have Psalm 40 in verse 5 is right along with this point, where it says, "Many, Lord, my God, are the wonders which you have done, and your thoughts toward us. There is no one to compare with you. If I would declare and speak of them, they would be too numerous to count." So you have His thoughts in the same vein as being talked about as His wonders. They're both numerous, too numerous to count, but they're displayed towards us, towards His people. That's the value that He places on His sheep, that He chooses to do. You have even Jeremiah 1 verse 5 is very similar in that for Jeremiah's, in a specific sense, and of course God talking to him there, where He said, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you as a prophet to the nations." The value that is clearly seen. Anything before we get to how we know the shepherd's voice back in John 10? Anyone want to bring up? All right, so we'll go back to John chapter 10 then and get to the latter part of this discussion. We have certainly verse 17 and 18, some things we've discussed of His laying down His life, the authority that He has. In verse 19 through 21, you have this dissension, as maybe your version says in verse 19, that occurs. You have some that equate what Jesus has done to thinking that He has a demon or that He's insane, and why should we listen to Him? You have others saying, how in the world could someone that's demon-possessed do these things? So you have this kind of back and forth between them. And we come back to another time, but in verse 25 through 30, we have a point in which Jesus is still speaking about sheep. Still talking about sheep and Himself in the shepherd kind of way by calling them my sheep. I want to go ahead and read those words. Would someone want to read verses John 10, 25 through 30? Cole?
Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me. But you do not believe because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life. They will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one."
Awesome. Thank you. So you have certainly, you see that I think well, I guess I'll ask first. What stands out to you when you see these verses? When you read what is said there? What's powerful to you? Robin?
Going back to the 19 to 21 part, something that I came across when I was trying to research these questions back here was that in that pen, that there would actually be multiple flocks overnight, which I didn't realize that multiple shepherds would bring their flocks and then just one person would watch it. And then in the morning when they went to get it, that voice would call that particular flock, which I thought was incredibly cool. But it's kind of cool if you think of that, with what's happening here with that division, because He's almost, as He's speaking, there's people, He used that word flocks. The Jews are there, they're having divisions, and they're all arguing, and He's trying to call out His little group among multiple flocks that are all kind of sitting there together, and being like, you need to hear me, and know me, because of all this craziness that's around you that can lose your focus kind of thing.
Yeah. And the call goes out to all of them, but the obedience is the key. They all hear it, but the obedience and knowing the voice. That's awesome. I didn't know that. Anything else? Yeah.
It's interesting, the question they ask, if you are the Christ, tell us plainly.
Mhm.
And I think really it's about their expectation of what the answer is. I mean, He goes on to say, I told you, but it's almost, we aren't getting the answer that they're expecting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, they want it plainly, as they say, and want it just plain and simple. He doesn't respond in a plain way like they were looking for, but He responded in the way that was obviously true. Ben?
This struck me with the Good Shepherd. It made me think of Jesus being a shepherd like David. That I give them eternal life; they'll never perish. No one can snatch
It's only the sheep, the individual, that can go away, right? I mean, it's that double emphasis of it in 28 and 29. Will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand, and then my Father. It's that same point of no one will take them away. You have the obedience that is clearly seen, that is needed. It's the listening and the following, and that he knows. He knows who are his. He knows, and he calls. You can't fool the shepherd. He knows who are his, and that we are to follow. Anything? Oh, yes.
I think going along with what Ron was saying too is when you think about the make of the crowd that was there and how similar their hearts could be to ours today. I mean, different in that you had people there who were looking for a physical king to come to the throne, and that's what they wanted to hear. And when they didn't hear that, they left him. And then you had those who wanted to catch him in a lie or catch him in something that they could accuse him with because they wanted the power over him. And then you had whatever percentage, maybe smaller, that truly just wanting a savior and wanting the Messiah and open to listen to what he actually said, even though it was different than what they probably had understood or expected. And I think, we can very easily make that comparison for ourselves today, how we have to make sure that we're not having, like Scott always says, in a box, but we don't have our expectation of what God is or what God wants for us or what God's plan or what he's going to do for us. And that we're not looking to argue all the time, but that we're really listening and open to have open hearts to whatever this actually teaches and what path that ends up leading us down that we don't expect.
I think it's interesting just in the whole of Jesus' ministry how he handles different situations. It's not uniform in how he handles different people. I think of just some examples. We'll go over to Luke chapter 7, actually, if you would turn there. How there's a difference in how Jesus handles this situation where it's blatant and he sees, he responds, he acts, and takes care of. But if you were to go to somewhere later on, like in Luke 21, not to go there now, but if you go on to where it's the widow there, that he sees her, but nothing changes about her circumstances. It says both he sees, both he cares, but doesn't mean there's a blatant change in circumstance. That doesn't mean he doesn't care any more or less. You just have this care that is seen. Now, I just want to go to Luke 7 for this point because the shepherd knows how his sheep feel. And I think that's just a powerful thing to think about is a comfort that he knows how we feel. We talked about he protects us, he knows our name, he provides, all of these things, and he does. But he knows your feelings. And we'll get to in a second, if the bell doesn't ring, that he hurts when we hurt. I mean, he knows, and we'll talk about that. In Luke 7, 11 through 15, you have Jesus walking to a city called Nain with his disciples and a large crowd following him. And he gets to the gate of a city, and he sees a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, who was also a widow. So you have the situation that she has found herself in already. Now her son has passed away. You can, especially in that culture, what the change that can come, the provision that could come, all these different questions, along with the grief that is felt there. And you have in verse 13 that Jesus sees her. He sees her, and he felt compassion for her. Felt compassion for her, and the first thing he does is go to her. Goes up to her, do not go on weeping. That's certainly because of what's going to happen. But that he feels and he goes. He sees her situation. He cares. He knows what it feels like, and he goes, and he, of course, changes the situation. Verse 15 at the end, you have the powerful words of, and Jesus gave him back to his mother after raising him from the dead. Like Jesus saw. So much is very interesting and studied, and encourage you to do so. In the Gospels, when it says Jesus saw or Jesus seeing, how oftentimes it's equated to compassion. And he's going to have compassion, and he acts in many of cases. But just this point of he knows how his sheep feel. He cares. When you go to Acts 9, a passage that may not obviously come to mind when you think about sheep and shepherds, but one of knowing his people's feelings. You have when Jesus speaks to Saul on his road to Damascus to go and to persecute more Christians, to bring them back this long distance from Damascus to Jerusalem. You have what is said to Jesus, that Jesus says to Paul, or Saul, in verse 4, was not, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting the Christians? Why are you persecuting these good people, or my people even? What did he say? Why are you persecuting me? That's mine. They're my people. So when we talk about the feeling that he has, he hurts when his people hurt. I know exactly, we all can. I know exactly what it's like in Acts chapter 12 when James is killed, how Jesus would have felt. How Jesus would have felt when Paul was nearly stoned to death. When his people are sick, when his people die, and was felt around by their other people. The care about the situation. All of these things, he knows. He knows and he cares. So with all of these things that the shepherd does, we can never forget that he always sees us. That doesn't mean we feel it. Doesn't mean we have the feeling that I know he's near, but I know he's there. Just like I talked about in Luke 21 earlier with the widow there. He saw her. Her situation didn't change. She's going to go away with no money to her name. As it said in Luke 21:4, she gave all that she had to live on. But Jesus saw her, and that was more than anything that money could buy that she had. So he sees, he cares. And the real power that we can have in that, the comfort that he sees and he cares. We can have ourselves maybe tell our lies that where's the shepherd? He's not here. He is. He's there. We may not see it, but we follow. We keep going. And just picture that beautiful picture of him being in front. Where are the sheep? Picture it in a literal sense, just following him. That some places on the ground may be this nice smooth grass where everything's nice and easy. That's the green pastures, and then we hit some spots that's rocky, like the valley of the shadow of death. But he's still the shepherd. He's still out in front. And then I may not know why, I may not know all these things, but I know who. And that's the most important answer that we could have, is I know who. I may not know why, where this is going, all these things, but I know the shepherd. And that's all I need to know. It's easy to say, of course. To live that out's different. But what a comfort that we all are able to have and continue to have. Are there any closing thoughts that anyone may have to that? I got a little preachy at the end, but very good. All right. Well, thank you all for your time. We'll go ahead and pick up tomorrow night. We'll look in John 15 and look at the vine, and Jesus being the vine, and us being the branches, and the Father being the vine dresser, and look forward to doing that. So, thank you.